So you may notice I am not Cliff. How come? And I have to say that maybe people found out. That's why there's less here. I don't know. Daniel has not been taught at Otisville a tremendous number of times. I think I remember myself every time. And mostly it was taught by Wally as he went through the entire Old Testament as part of an Old Testament survey. And we didn't spend a lot of time on each book. Bob, you act like you remember that. I do too. The only time I remember that Daniel was taught as a separate book was by my brother, probably more than 30 years ago. And I don't know if anybody else had the intestinal fortitude to do that until Cliff came up a few months ago and said, I think I'm going to teach Daniel. And I almost choked. And I thought, no, let's give him a chance. And he's done a great job. Absolutely. He's done a really good job. But there's coming up some things that we've already talked about a little bit in the book that have to do with some of the numbers and phrases that refer to what we might call the last days. And I had discussed this a little bit with Cliff and mentioned that I had some notes together, and he goes, when can you present it? How about this Sunday? So I scurried and finished some things up. This is probably not going to take the entire class, even though Cliff hopes it will. But it's going to take at least half. Too often in the Bible, it is read like a set of encyclopedias. And I think some of us that are older were taught that way. Okay? And there's some real hazards with that. It's not like it's not like this. What we did a lot for a long time, I know I did, was that if we needed to know something, we use a concordance and we start looking up verses, and we take those verses and paste them together and put them into some kind of coherent thought. But what that ends up doing a lot of times is simply reinforcing what we already thought, because the verses are taken out of context. They have nothing to do with the stream of what the Bible is about. Although the Bible is full of moralistic statements, its primary purpose is not to preach good morals, believe it or not. Too often we also use it as a club to beat people over the head when that's not the purpose of the Bible. It's got morals in it, and we should know them, but that's not its purpose. And even though the Bible has history, often the Bible is simply taught, the Old Testament specifically is simply taught as history. That's important, but it's still not the purpose of the Bible. They are simply byproducts of a holy God. Okay? Writing in real-time history. That's moral. That's where they come from, and that's what we should strive for. So who remembers the three important things about what the Bible is about, and who the subject and the theme of the Bible are? We've talked about this in some of my other classes in the past. Some of you may still remember that, and some of you may have forgotten, and some of you I know were not here. Okay? Anybody want to venture to guess? Okay? The Bible is a story. What is its purpose? To show how a holy and righteous God... Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot this. The Bible is a story. I want to talk about this before I mention those other three. The Bible is a story just like any three-act play. And I've gone into detail on this at other times, and I may do so in the future. We're going to see this slide again in a couple of minutes. It has a beginning. The very beginning of a lot of stories is when the events start, everything's good. Okay? Think of Cinderella. Things are good with her dad. And then there comes a plot point at which evil comes in, the evil stepsisters and the stepmom. And then we can go through, we can find a changing point later on in most every story. In Cinderella, the changing point is Prince Charles in the slipper, all right? The Bible is exactly the same way. At the plot point 1, we have the entrance of the serpent. And then throughout the entire rest of the Old Testament, we have the story of conflict. And God tells us that conflict. And then finally, we get to what's known as the plot point 2, which is the resolution, in this case, is Jesus. And that's what the entire middle part, starting with chapter 3, is about. The whole thing. Okay? It's not a bunch of history and morals. It's about this coming Messiah. That's what it's about. So we end up with that first clue coming in chapter 3, which is sometimes known as the Chekhov's gun. We've talked about that before. I will do that at another time. I'm not going to get into detail, but a Chekhov's gun is something that comes up early in a story, and it becomes the solution to the story later on, but you don't know it until it actually is what's called fired. Okay? This was something that was defined by a Russian playwright, and basically what he said was that if something is introduced, he mentioned if a gun is shown on the wall or on a shelf early in a play, it must be fired before the end of the play, and it ends up being the solution. In this case, the Bible, in Genesis chapter 3:15, there's an obscure verse that we do not really understand, and that verse is, he shall crush the head of the serpent and get his heel bruised at the same time. Why is that there? Adam and Eve don't really understand that, and it's something you can gloss over. That's where the gun is loaded, and the Chekhov's gun is fired when Jesus comes and he dies on the cross. We look at this as an entire story. And then at the end, there's an Act 3, and things get better. They are better than they were even before at the beginning. And that's the way the Bible is written, as this long story, so to speak. So what we have is the purpose of the Bible is how to show that, to show how a righteous and holy God can dwell with his unholy images. And God chose to show us this by defining himself as the topic of the Bible. And then he uses the theme, and he does this by telling us a long and involved story, all the way from Genesis through Revelation, historically and morally good story, but it's about what? It's about a seed that came in Genesis chapter 3:15 as a hint to a problem that arose just after chapter 2. Now, remember, Cliff mentioned, I don't know, last week or the week before, Steve July's number 2 rule for Bible interpretation. Who remembers what he said, what it is? Yes. Don't make them contradict. Did you remember that because he said it? Do you remember all the way back from Steve?
He said it, I remember.
Yeah. See, there's a few here that still remember that. Excellent. You get the A today. Excellent. Excellent. Yeah. Never let a difficult passage of Scripture contradict an easy one. And that's what too often people do. And these phrases we're going to be talking about today, that's done with those all the time. Now, I want to give you a corollary to that, all right? Corollary to this particular one. The corollary is always place a passage of Scripture in the context of what the whole Bible is speaking about. Not just in the context of 1 Peter or the context of Genesis or the context of what the whole Bible is speaking about. All right? What's the whole Bible speaking about? It's speaking about how a holy and righteous God can dwell with an unholy people whose subject is God and whose main theme is a seed. if we're not placing them in that context, if we're looking at them as a set of encyclopedias and simply looking up what we want to make sure people know about good morals or to be saved, we're going to miss the entire point. And that's when people are fooled. And I'm telling you that most of the world, including really, really devout Christians, do this all the time. And it wasn't until several years ago, probably 15 years ago or so, I really started opening my eyes and seeing we have to look at the Bible this way, not that other way, before we start to really understand what God's trying to tell us. So, stories like the turning point of Genesis, the turning point in the Bible, like we just said, was Genesis 3:15, and I will put an enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed, and he shall bruise your heel, you shall bruise your head. He shall bruise your head, you shall bruise his heel. He's talking to the serpent when he says that. It is vague, but it claims that there is a seed of woman that is coming that will crush the head of the serpent, the evil one, the tempter. What does this imply about a timeline? I never saw this for a long time, but this deals with what we're talking about with, as far as I'm concerned, with the 1260 days, with the 42 weeks, with the times, half times, with the end times. Okay, all of those. What does this say about the time frame? It's in the future. It's not now. It seems easy, but that's important. Okay, as we go through some other scriptures here, this is really important, the fact that it didn't happen now. Now, there's evidence. Well, last time I taught Genesis, I think this is true now. I think Eve thought that her next kid was going to be that one. And I think there's times throughout the Bible when people thought that was true. Okay? But it still wasn't then. All right? But exactly when this happened is never revealed. As the story continues in the Old Testament, there are myriads of hints and clues as to who is being spoken of, what he is going to be like, where he will be born, what and why he will do what he does, and when he is to come. The who, what, where, why, and how are all in that Old Testament over and over and over again. But not in a way we can pick it up and understand it if we didn't have the New Testament. It is in a way that is cryptic. It is in a way that progresses and gets more and more and more revealing as time went on. And it's like a big jigsaw puzzle. When you put it all together, you should see Jesus. Daniel's primary purpose is not moralistic. That's what we teach to our kids. That's what a lot of times all that's taught in books when they study Daniel to adults. It's not moralistic. It's not something like follow God and the lions in the fire won't be able to get you. That's not what it's about. Daniel writes about which one of those who, you know what I'm talking about. Those 5 things. I can't ever like say them real fast. Which one of those is Daniel about? When? Daniel is about when. That's one of his major purposes, and he does this several times throughout the book. So the book is still about Jesus, and it's telling us when this promised seed, who they didn't know who he was going to come. Yes? Bob's trying to make it so that you don't have to teach today.
It sounds to me like it's kind of hard to tell somebody something if you don't know the whole story.
Yes! Bob, exactly! And we don't know that. I agree 100%. That's what I've been trying to say that for over 15 years here. And I didn't fully understand it 25 years ago myself. But until we start to understand that whole story, you're right. We can't know it ourselves. We can't tell somebody else. That is, you get an A++, Bob. We got some good students in here. I'm going to have to start inventing some new grades. Daniel is, a lot of Daniel is about the when, okay? We'll talk about that in a minute because Cliff already has started that. I'm not going to go into it deep because he already has. So, we are just beginning to see some of these terms in Daniel, and the terms, and in other places in the Bible, the last days, the latter days, the end times, the times, half times, 1,260 days, 42 months, 3.5 years. Okay? What if I told you that every single one of those is the same? That's what we're going to talk about. And I did not fully understand that, how that worked and why, until the last time I taught the book of Revelation. And all of a sudden, it snapped, and I fully understood it. This is not hard anymore, guys. Okay? And they're all talking about the time of Jesus and the church. All right? All of them. They're not talking about some time that's going to happen during our lifetime. The Old Testament never predicts what's going to happen to you and me as far as events in history. It never, ever does that. Ever. Always remember that, no matter what anybody else tells you. These are all talking about the same thing. People often hear one of these terms and they freak out because they have been led to believe that these are code words for some kind of great tragedy at the end of the world. But they are not. Even though most people think so, and I mean most. In fact, this kind of terminology is used all over the Old Testament, and if you look at them critically, they all have something in common. So we're going to look at about a half a dozen of them today. We're going to start with Genesis chapter 49, verse 1. And Nathan talked about Genesis chapter 49 not too long ago and did a good job of it. But we're going to talk about one extra thing here that I don't remember if he brought up or not. So Jacob here is handing out blessings to his 12 sons. It's at the end of Genesis. He's very old. He's about ready to die. And in verse 1, he says, "And Jacob called the sons and said, 'Gather together, that I may tell you what may befall you in the last days.'" Now he goes through and he gives a blessing on each one of those 12 sons. It is Judah that we are most concentrating on. When we get to Judah, he says, "Your brothers shall praise you, you neck on your enemies, bow down before you, crouched as a lion, scepter that shall not depart from Judah, ruler's staff, to him shall the obedience shall be the obedience of the peoples." Who did Nathan say? And in other classes we've talked about this. I know I did when I taught Genesis. Who is this talking about? Well, initially, Jacob with the staff and the scepter is referring back to an incident that happened between Judah and Tamar. Okay? If you remember the story, Judah and Tamar had an affair. He forced himself on her, and she tricked him and ended up getting his staff. So the staff was taken away from Judah. All right? Anybody remember that story a little bit? But this is saying that the staff shall not depart from Judah. This is kind of a double meaning, so to speak. He's saying that's not going to happen again, but he's being predictive because God, of course, is the author of the Old Testament. And who is he actually talking about? He's talking about that promised seed that was in Genesis chapter 3:15 that's going to come sometimes in the future and have the staff, which means he's talking about the promised seed. Okay? They don't know that it's Jesus yet. They just know that it's the promised seed. But yes, he's talking about Jesus. This is Jesus language. Notice that Jacob prefaces all of this by saying that this is what is going to befall you in the last days. Okay, so in Genesis chapter 3:15, we got this is in the future. Now we've got a definition for it. It's called the last days. All right? Let's move over to Numbers chapter 24. We find the story of Balaam and Balak. When we teach that, most of the time we emphasize the talking donkey and a few other things, all right? There's about 4 chapters there. It's kind of important because it's a lot of time spent in the Bible on that particular incident. Balaam ends up becoming a prophet, so to speak. Even though he wasn't a believer in the one true God, he ends up being a prophet, and the things that he speaks are predictive. And he says that this is going to happen in the last days. What is it that he says is going to happen? A few verses down he says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall crush the forehead of Moab. Who's that talking about? The promised seed. When? In the latter days. This isn't something that Daniel and John and Daniel in Revelation pull out of a hat. This is something that we have to put in context with the rest of the Bible. This latter days is talking about this promised seed that's coming. And it's just simply another clue. And it even comes from an atheist or a person that doesn't believe in the one true God, like Balaam himself. That's what's important in that story, not the talking donkey. It's referencing also, if you notice real close, it's referencing chapter 3 of Genesis. Crush the forehead, and Genesis 49, the scepter. If we read it as a story, we should go, oh, you know, we started in Genesis, now we're up to Numbers. You know, we got through all of the, this guy begot this guy begot this guy begot, all that boring stuff, which is important, that's the history, all right? And we got through all of the, this guy sacrifices that, and this happens on this day, and we get to these things, and these things are pointing us to what's important in there, okay? Because we're reading it as a story about how God, a holy and righteous God, can dwell with his people again. Let's move ahead. In other words, the story is building. Let's move ahead to Joel chapter 2, verse 28. Anybody know where else in the Bible this is referenced besides Terry? You should. And I know you do, but you're probably just not thinking about it. All right? What we have here is the word forward. Unfortunately, that's probably not the best translation of that word, even though in the Hebrew that's what it means. But if we look at it in the Greek, it means last, at the last, or latter. Okay? Why would that be important? Because it is the Greek that Peter is quoting from in Acts chapter 2. Okay? That's what Peter is quoting from in Acts chapter 2. This is from Joel. What chapter did I say in Joel? I forget. Joel chapter 2. I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. And it goes on and talks about a lot of other stuff. What is that referring to? It's referring to whatever that afterwards, which is really the last or at last or the latter is. And who is it that speaks this later on? It's Peter in Acts chapter 2. And in the last days, that's the word forward in most translations. Not all, but most translations have forward back in Joel. He's quoting Joel. It shall be, declares God. Okay? In other words, afterwards in Joel chapter 2, verse 28 is equal to last days that Peter uses in Acts chapter 2. It's the same thing. And look what Peter does. This is from Acts chapter 2. I will pour out my spirit on the people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will see visions. What does that sound like? It sounds like exactly what we just read in Joel, because that's what Peter says. This is what was prophesied by Joel. What was it that is happening that was prophesied by Joel? Anybody, you should know this. This should be the easiest question in the class today. The establishment of the church. Because they saw them speaking in tongues and they thought they were drunk. And he said, no, this is what Joel was talking about. The church is being established. When? In the latter days. In the forward. In the afterwards. In the latter days. This is a direct point. A direct point of contact as to what that means. Not sometime way after Jesus when he's coming back. It's talking about the beginning of the church. And it has been ever since Genesis 3:15. Let's look at another one. Oops. Isaiah. There you go. It shall come to pass in the, when? Latter days, that the mountains of the house of the Lord shall be established, and many people shall come. And I've taken out some things so that I can get to the points that I want. It's a little longer passage than that. And many people shall come to the house of God of Jacob, and shall teach his ways, and may walk his paths. What's that a prophecy about? What did Isaiah prophesy about over and over and over again? He becomes pretty clear. There's a lot of things in Isaiah that people that are atheists can't explain unless they make Isaiah as a book that was written after the time of Jesus, because he's so specific about what's going to happen, and all those things happen. This is Jesus talk again. Latter days is when Jesus is going to come. Let's take a look at Micah now. It says, it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established. Who do you think that's talking about? Okay, it's talking about when Jesus comes. And it's talking about his establishment of the church. The language in the following verses after this describe the coming of Jesus and that establishment. Now, before we move to Daniel, and we're going to talk about a couple places in Daniel, I want to first of all show you this. So when are those last days? See that red part? All right? They start. The important part is that beginning of the establishment of the church. And that arrow actually should not continue like forever, because it's not going to be there forever. But it's during that. What time period are we talking about? Now. The last days are talking about now. Okay? Watch my Revelation class. I explain that in detail. It's up online. 22 lessons on the Otisville YouTube channel. Okay? I know there are several people right now that are going through it again. It was probably a class that I'm most proud of, because I finally understood that book. And I think I have most of it right. Maybe not every single thing, but I think I have most of it right now. It's taken me my whole life. So, Revelation picks up this idea and borrows from the Old Testament. There are 250 direct quotes in Revelation that directly quote the Old Testament. And there are 500 more references that are allusions to the Old Testament. There's only 400 verses in Revelation. It's like they took the Old Testament, John did, cut it up, pieced it back together, and said, this is what it's talking about. Okay? We don't study it that way, because we don't know enough about the Old Testament to understand Revelation. That's our problem. The Jewish people did, because they were raised on it and they were taught it day after day from the time they were very little until the time they died. So they should have been able to see what John said. They didn't because, well, not all of them, but they as a group didn't, because they rejected Jesus as the Christ. We don't, because we don't know what they knew. Anybody that tells you the Old Testament doesn't need to be studied is slaughtering the Bible. It has to be studied. There was a joke once. My dad used to tell this all the time, one of my dad's favorite jokes. A comedian took a friend of his to a comic convention one time, and they're sitting there at the dinner, and somebody yells out a number, and everybody starts laughing. Somebody else a little bit later yells out another number, and everybody just like belly laughs, almost pees their pants. The guy says, I don't understand what's going on. And the guy said, well, we've all been around so much. There's this book that's got all these jokes in it, and they're all numbered, and we have it memorized. All I have to do is say the number, and we all remember the joke. And the guy says, give me a really good number. And the guy says, 52. It's a really good one. So his friend yells out, 52. Nobody laughs. What happened? The guy says, the comedy friend says, some people can tell them and some can't. The point of that, I think my dad was trying to make, I don't know for sure, but the point of that in this is that a lot of times in the New Testament, they are putting a small smattering of an Old Testament passage or an Old Testament idea that if you knew the Old Testament, you would immediately go back there and know exactly what they're talking about. Because if every time they did that, they quoted the entire passage of that verse, the Bible wouldn't be big, it would be like 10 times the size, because we're repeating things over and over again. The writers of the New Testament are understanding that you already know the Old Testament when they say their phrases in the New Testament. And we don't study it that way. John is simply using the Old Testament to write the New Testament, to write the book of Revelation. All right, now I just want to talk about a couple passages in Daniel. Here's the first one, and Cliff has already talked about this one. We're not going to spend any time on it, but Daniel 2:28 says, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar that what will be in the latter days. What's the latter days? We've already pointed out that the Old Testament is very, very specific as to what those latter days are. And the New Testament tells us in detail that they happened. All right? So, this is the story, of course, of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And it's explaining through a very large image that is made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay as to when Jesus is going to come. That's going to end up being the latter days when that image has taken place. And we talked about the kingdoms that he's talking about. I think you're in chapter 7 right now, right? Yeah. So he's going to come pretty quick to this. And they shall be given into his hands for a time, times, and half times. Now this is where Daniel shifts a little bit and starts using something that is not used in, as far as I know, the other parts of the Old Testament. But if you want to know this, how it fits, more detail than what I'm going to tell today, watch the first 2 lessons on symbolisms in the Bible, and there's part of it on the number symbolisms in that Revelation class. All right, Bob just got done watching it, right? That was in there, if I remember right. Correct. And we talk about it again there. Yeah, we talk about it off and on throughout that class. Good. I just want to remember. I just wanted to know whether I was remembering that right. So if you've been in some of my classes over the last quite a few years, you understand, and you probably already do on your own anyway, that there are certain specific numbers, 3, 4, 7, 10, 12, 40, are very, very important numbers in the Bible, and they're not necessarily numbers that deal with quantity. They deal with ideas, okay? And they're used over and over and over in various places to bring forth certain kinds of ideas. Now, look at this. Time times half times. Time, 1, times 2. Times means more than 1. Half times, 3.5. This is half of 7. That's significant, all right? 7 is the blessed number. 3.5, 3.5 times 360 days is 1260. That's where the 1260 comes from in Revelation and in Daniel. 1260 days divided by 30 is 42 months. That's where the 42 months comes from. These numbers are all referring to the same thing. No, 1260 days is all it's talking about, but it's not a literal number of days or a literal number of years. It's an unspecified time span signifying the latter days. Okay? These are all referring to the same thing. They are all the same thing as the end time and the latter days. It's an unspecified period of time. We don't know. They didn't know in the Old Testament exactly when Jesus is coming, and we don't know how long this period that we're living in that the church is right now. So they use these kinds of terminologies instead. The time being referred to begins with what? In Revelation, at least, we're going to talk about that towards the end, just a brief, very, very briefly. But the time being referred to begins when? You should know this. We've already talked about it a lot. When Jesus came and the church was established.
Jesus came and set up his kingdom. And
Yep.
that means, like Acts 2, the church.
Exactly. By the way, watch the Revelation class and you'll know that the 1,000-year reign is talking about the same thing.
Say that again?
The 1,000-year reign, I believe, is talking of the same thing. Exactly the same thing. And 1,000 is a very important number because it's 10 times 10 times 10, and 10 is a very important number. It's symbolic. Let's look at Daniel chapter 12, verse 7. I think you're going to get out of class today. I thought I saw a smile on your face. I didn't think this was going to take that long.
Oh, I know you.
12. And I heard a man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream. He raised his right hand and his left hand towards heaven and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, and half time. Okay? Same time period, same idea going on. And I'm going to let Cliff deal with what Daniel is talking about a little more specifically and not ruin his thunder when he gets there. But this chapter is usually titled, the chapter in Daniel, this particular chapter 12 is usually titled at the top of a lot of Bibles, the time of the end. In other words, most people that translate the Bible and most people that read the Bible think that Daniel is talking about at the end of our age when Jesus is coming back. That was what the time times, half times is talking about. It's not. Okay? The Old Testament, prophets, and all of the symbols all point to one thing. They point to Jesus. They do not point to beyond Jesus, to our days. They don't do that. Anybody that tells you they is being fooled. And that's, like I said, the majority of people in all churches. It speaks of a time when the seed, Jesus, would come and the period of time of the church that follows. Later in the same chapter of Daniel, Daniel will use the numbers 1290 and 1335. And I'm hoping Cliff will come up with an answer for those because I've got some ideas, but I've read some things about it. Terry might have some things. We're not going to get into it today, but I can guarantee we'll get into it later. But I'm not going to go into specifics on those right now. The popular view is that Jesus is speaking about some grand thing that's going to happen at the end of the world, but none of these are giving clues as to when this is happening. So, the last days, the latter days, the 1260 days, the 42 months, the times, and half times, that's all talking about the church period from the time the church was established until Jesus comes back again. All right? That's what John is almost exclusively referring to, with a very few exceptions. Okay, listen to this. The Old Testament prophets use these terminologies to predict when the beginning of the time period would begin. Okay? In other words, when Jesus would come. The Old Testament uses those phrases to predict when Jesus would come. John, in the book of Revelation, on the other hand, uses these same terms to describe the kinds of things that are going to take place ever since Jesus had established the church and will continue to take place until he comes back. Okay? Is that clear? You take away nothing from this today, but that you will have done well. And we're talking about, in Revelation, the persecution of the church, the rewards that you're going to get. All of that stuff is mixed up in symbolic language from the Old Testament, but the time period is the church age that he's talking about.
Not a specific number of years.
No.
It's the church age.
Correct. But these Old Testament and New Testament phrases and references are never predictive of when Jesus is going to come back. They are never used for that purpose, even though most of the world thinks so. Daniel will use some other numbers, like I just mentioned, and I don't have those all figured out, but I'm not sure I have to. But the one thing I know is that God doesn't give us a tip-off as to when the end of the world is going to come. And he does that because Jesus says, I don't even know. He's not telling me. If he ain't telling Jesus, he ain't telling us. All right? So, like we said before, never let a difficult passage contradict an easy one. And some of these others that we talked about today are pretty easy. All right? So we can't let those numbers fool us into thinking something else is happening when we're looking at the Bible as a story. Any comments or questions? That's all I got. Unless you want Cliff to get up there for like 3 minutes. Yeah.
I see the Old Testament as the New Testament, because when God was telling us he put forth out, the New Testament says that he took all the flaws out of it and made it new.
He took what?
They took the flaws out of the Old Testament and made it new. So it's still kind of all the same thing.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of us were taught as kids, and it's true that through the different ages of humanity, God dealt with people in different ways. And in these latter days, what does he do? Hebrews tells us in these last days, we're ruled by the Son.
He was making sacrifice. He knew that way back there. He was preparing everybody. And then when he becomes the sacrifice,
The whole Old Testament is a preparation to show us who he was and to show us why it was necessary. Like, yeah, absolutely. Who else? All right. I thank you.
Thank you. you.